Okay. So, should I start? Okay. So I guess I need to introduce myself as well. So my name is Fernando. So I work, I'm a PhD student at NYU, and I work in this lab, VIDA, Visualization and Data Analysis Lab. We are in Brooklyn, New York. It's one of the campus from NYU. And this lab is basically like a mix of database and visualization people. So we usually try to make a lot of collaboration, like for both sides, from visualizing data and also providing efficient access to data, right? So in this talk, I'll show you a little bit about our work on reproducibility, and specifically reproducibility after the fact, and I'm going to define that term later in the talk. Okay, so since we are in a data science center and in a reproducibility seminar, I guess, I didn't think it would be necessary to actually motivate the need for reproducibility or why it's important, right? So I'll just skip that, okay? I hope everyone here is convinced that we need reproducibility. But I want to say that reproducibility may be hard. And what I mean by hard is like computationally hard, right? And why is that? Well, I mean, not only computationally, but one of the reasons is also for computationally, it's two labors, right? So, but there are many reasons why reproducibility may be hard. So one of them is because it requires a cultural change, right? So reproducibility should be a standard, but unfortunately it's not in computational science. And people usually say that, well, I don't want to post my code on GitHub or on the web because maybe someone will get my code and then they'll publish something about it, and I don't get to publish more, right? So you have a potential loss of future publications because you posted your code on the web. And then people are also shy sometimes about their code because they wrote their code in a hurry for a publication, and they don't want to spend some time on cleaning the code, and they say, well, I don't want people to see my code, it's a mess, and then I don't know how to program very well, and I did it in a hurry, so I don't want to post it. So there are like many excuses on people, like they don't actually want to make their code reproducible. And it's really a culture change because we have been teaching reproducibility right now in computational science, so it requires a lot of effort. Another reason is the potential lack of attribution. So maybe if you use someone else's code, maybe you don't cite, and then that person doesn't get the right attribution for that use of the code, right? Which is also a little bit related to the cultural change. A third reason is also legal barriers, because maybe you have your code or your data that has copyright, so you cannot actually make it distributable. And a fourth reason, which is really the focus of this talk, is that it's burdensome, right? It requires a lot of effort. And the thing is, so this is all to say that as a culture change, we as a community are trying to bring awareness of the need of reproducibility in computational science. For the lack of attribution, there has been work on data citation. I mean, it's still a long process, but people are engaging on that process to actually make better methods to give the right attribution when you're citing code, when you're using someone else's code and software. So legal barriers is a whole other discussion that I'm not going to start here right now. And then, so the focus of this talk is really this, that computational reproducibility requires a lot of effort. And why is that? Well, first of all, usually computational experiments, they have too many dependencies, right? So first, you have your data. So you may use lots of input files, you may produce lots of output files, you may have many parameters that you want to try on. And then keeping track of that is hard. So the second thing is the workflow, right? So you have like all those steps that you do for your data analysis, and then each step uses a different tool. And then when you want to make this reproducible, you also want to kind of like track all these steps. And it may be hard as well because you may have a huge pipeline, a huge data flow. And the third part is the environment. So library dependencies, right? So tracking library dependencies is not easy. And it's not only, so if you consider the author-reviewer scenario, right, it's hard for authors to actually track those dependencies, but also for the reviewer or someone else that's trying to reproduce your experiment to actually install these dependencies, and it's actually a problem that we colloquially know as dependency hell, right? So you need to install one dependency, but then you need to install another dependency, and so on, right? So it's really a pain in the neck. And these three basically aspects of the dependency part is what we call provenance, right? So basically what you need to do is that you need to track the provenance of your experiment. So provenance is basically the origin, the reasoning that you actually use to derive a result, an output, right? So if you want to replicate that result, you need to know all the steps that you actually went through, including the data, the workflow, and the library dependencies. Because even if you change one version of library dependency, you may actually get a totally different result. So another reason why it's hard is because there are too many platforms. And the thing is that if you want someone to actually reproduce your experiment, that person may not have the same OS as you. So providing some sort of flexibility on installing your experiment in other OSs also requires some effort, because some library dependencies may be totally different from one environment to the other. And then what happens is that since it requires it requires so much effort, what happens is that people don't have much time to actually make their experiments reproducible, or at least this is the excuse they use for not making their experiment reproducible, right? And then we have a bunch of sentences here from like keynotes and reports for reproducibility that actually shows that people don't make their experiments reproducible because it requires a lot of effort and because it's too time-consuming and error-prone, right? So the first one is actually from the reproducibility effort from Sigmod, while the authors, they complain that it requires too much work for the benefit derived. So it's a lot of work. I don't see the benefit of reproducibility. Why would I care, right? And then the second one was a keynote on the Beyond the PDF2 conference where they did a survey, and then basically insufficient time was the main reason for people not making actually their data and code reproducible. And then you have another survey on the machine learning community where 77% claim that they don't have time to document and clean up the code. And then this actually technical report is very interesting if you guys want to check it out. Repeatability and benefaction in computer systems research. So they basically try to reproduce a bunch of papers from different computer science conference, and I think it was around like 22% they could actually reproduce, and all the others they could not reproduce. And they actually try to contact the authors. So if you don't find the code on the web, they try to contact the authors to actually reproduce the results. And then many of the answers were that it requires a huge amount of effort to actually make this reproducible. So we are not going to do that. So needless to say that this is expensive if you don't plan for reproducibility. If you're planning for reproducibility since the beginning, then you may have a bunch of tools that can actually help you to make your experiment reproducible, right? So you have scientific workflow systems that you have provenance capture for free, so you don't even need to take care of all these issues, right? And then you have virtual machines, right? You can create your project since the beginning in a virtual machine, and then you can easily share that virtual machine with others, or in even lightweight, lighter containers, like for instance a Docker container, right? And you also have configuration management tools where you actually write recipes on how to configure the system, so you can actually configure how you actually install all these library dependencies, so that if a person wants to reproduce your result, they just need to use one of these tools and one of these scripts, one of these recipes to actually configure the system to run your experiment, right? And many others, okay? But what's the problem? What about reproducibility after the fact? And what I mean by reproducibility after the fact? I have my project, it's done, I didn't plan for reproducibility, or I started planning for reproducibility, but then at a certain point I had to publish my paper, I was in a hurry, and I didn't have time to make it reproducible enough, right? So now I have my project here, and I want to publish my paper, and I also want to publish my code and my data, or someone is requiring me to do so, okay? So what do I do? You could use one of those systems. Yes, you could. But it's, again, time-consuming and error-prone. Why? Because you need to port your entire experiment to one of those systems, right? So if you want to use scientific workflow systems, you need to actually put everything on that system, and it may require a lot of work, and for some cases, it may even be impossible to do so. Okay, and the same thing for virtual machines. You need to reconfigure all the environment in a virtual machine so that you can run your experiment, and so on. So what we need is that more automated and clean ways to actually make it easier to do reproducibility. So for the reproducibility after the fact, so here are some requirements basically. So first we have the provenance capture, right? So we need to capture the provenance of that experiment, the data, the workflow, and all the dependencies, right? And then from the provenance capture, we can think of two ways that we can use that provenance for reproducibility. The first one is doing some provenance analysis, right? So you have the provenance, and then you want to analyze that provenance to understand why your experiment actually derived those results, and then maybe you have like different executions and you want to understand why one is different than the other, right? So then you can do some provenance analysis to try to understand that, and this is also key for reproducibility. So the second way you can go with the provenance capture is actually to make a more practical use of the provenance, more executable use, which is actually get this provenance and make something executable where you can actually replicate the results and maybe reuse some of these parts of this experiment, right? So that means that maybe supporting different platforms, allowing the replicability of the results, and maybe also allowing modifiability. By modifiability, I mean reusing that and maybe changing some of the algorithms or something inside the software, right? And of course, these things are not isolated, okay? They can also communicate to each other. I mean, it's not that they are actually exclusive. You can also have something that goes in between, right? And the process should be simple, automatic, and non-intrusive, right? So that actually people don't need to say that it's too time-consuming to actually make my experiment reproducible. So in our group and with some other collaborators, we try to build tools that actually aims to facilitate that process of reproducibility, right? And two tools that we are developing right now are related to these two actually ways: provenance analysis and replicability and reusability of assets, right? So the first one is noWorkflow. It's more related to provenance analysis. And the second one, which is ReproZip, is more related to the practical use of provenance so that you can actually replicate your results. And currently, they don't talk to each other, but that is something that we want to do in the future, like integrate both things, both provenance analysis and also like this practical use of provenance in the same tool, right? So I will start talking about noWorkflow, which is a collaboration between our university in NYU and some researchers from a federal university in Brazil. And these two, João Felipe and Leonardo, are the real developers of the tool. Okay, so basically, noWorkflow, the idea of noWorkflow came from, we have been working with scientific workflows for a long time. And scientific workflows are great, but again, if you're working on them since the beginning, right? So then, suppose that I have my script, and I still want to have the same provenance capabilities, the same analysis, so that you can understand your experiment, but outside that system, right? I don't want to port my script to this system. So what I want is provenance for scripts, and not inside a scientific workflow system. So the goal here is to provide provenance analysis for a script. But what is the challenge here? The challenge is that you want to provide a transparent and non-intrusive provenance capture for that script, right? And why is this challenging? Because you don't have an instrumented environment. So here you're not assuming anything. You're not assuming a version control system. You're not assuming that there's a scientific workflow system in the background. You're not assuming nothing of this. So you basically have your script and you run that script. And now you want actually to capture the provenance of that script. So this is challenging, and there has been some tools around for capturing provenance for scripts. But then some of them, they capture different provenance levels. So here the provenance that we're talking about is actually like the script definition. So you want to see something like the function calls, the arguments, right, the variables. And while some of the systems, like OS level tools, they actually track system calls, so it's not the same level, and it's hard to actually reconcile that provenance information with the script itself. And then some of them are actually intrusive, right? So I have scientific workflow systems because you need to port your experiment to those systems. And then you have other tools that they actually require user-defined annotations throughout the script so that you can actually capture the information you want, right? Although it's nice because you actually can define whatever you want to be captured, it's also a lot of work because you may have like really long scripts and then you need to adding annotations throughout all those scripts. And then you also have like solutions that are non-transparent where you require also the user in the loop to actually tell you what also needs to be captured. And the last one, it actually doesn't, it uses a compile framework to actually get the provenance, but then that doesn't capture information, for instance, of scripts that they have dynamic information like Python, right? So what we built was noWorkflow, which is basically transparently captures the provenance of scripts. And basically the approach is language independent, but we provide a solution for Python because Python is used a lot. It's, and we also have many collaborators that use Python, so it would be a good, could actually have good use cases for that as well. But the approach is pretty much language independent, so it could be applied for many other scripting languages. And it's non-intrusive, so you don't need to add annotations, you don't need an instrumented environment, so you don't need any of these requirements. You just need, if you have that script, you can run with noWorkflow to capture the provenance. And then it has many different ways to actually analyze the provenance, right? So you can visualize the different trials, you have an evolution graph. So if you have like different trials of your experiment, you can see the evolution, and you can also go back to previous versions. You can have diff analysis so that I have two different executions. What is different about them? And you can also do some querying, and there's some support for IPython notebooks, so you can actually analyze the results in an IPython notebook. So how does noWorkflow work? So basically, if you have your experiment that runs Python and then your script, instead of running with Python, you're going to run with noWorkflow. Now, run, and then the script. And that's basically it. You don't need to do anything else, because the noWorkflow will call Python and at the same time capture the provenance for you, basically. So that's the only thing you need to do to capture the provenance. You just need to replace Python with noWorkflow. But then, how does noWorkflow actually work internally, right? So first you have the provenance capture, okay? So for the provenance capture, so first of all, you have different provenance that you can capture, right? So here I'm showing the definition provenance, which is basically the script as is, right? So you have that structure of your script with the function calls and so on. So that's the definition provenance. Deployment provenance is basically the library dependencies, whatever you are importing for your script, right? And then execution provenance is when you're executing your experiment, what happens, right? So for the definition provenance, we just use an abstract syntax tree analysis, which is basically just the structure of the script. So if you have like loops and while, so it actually identifies what block of code is inside which, right? So that's basically the AST analysis, and Python has module to actually provide this analysis for us. And we also use some disassembly, which is basic. So Python has some, it compiles the script in bytecode, which are the PYC files. And we basically also read that bytecode to actually get more finer-grained information about the script, right? Because we can get more information when we read those bytecodes. And then for deployment provenance, we just use Python's modules to get all the dependencies, right? So, and the main one that we use is module finder. So module finder basically finds all the dependencies that are used in your script. And then we also have